100 years ago next Monday, Britain entered the First World War. It was a decision that would cost 35,000 Irish soldiers their lives. So what did those soldiers die for, and did Britain need to enter the war at all? Well, joining me now to talk about this is Peter Hitchens, columnist with the Mail on Sunday in London. Peter, good morning.
Good morning, Pat.
Now, going back to 1914, the conventional wisdom suggests that Germany was getting too big for its boots. Wilhelm II had built this navy to try to rival the British Navy, so it was time to sort it all out.
Well, for a start, the naval arms race between Britain and Germany was over before 1914, with the Germans conceding defeat. I think their navy eventually reached about 40% the size of ours, and they simply couldn't afford to make it any bigger. So that was already over before the problem began. So I think we can rule that out. There were certainly people who feared that a rising Germany was in some way a threat to the British Empire, but I've never really been able to see quite exactly what form that threat took. Germany's interest has been really since the beginning of the 20th century in expanding eastwards and taking over chunks of the Russian Empire, something it's doing now under the guise of the European Union. So it really wasn't going to bother Germany whether we continue to control India or large parts of Africa or other parts of the empire, which we've, of course, subsequently lost largely as a result of bankrupting ourselves in 1914-18.
So Britain could have left well enough alone, let the Germans have their expansionist quarrels with those to the east of them, and you believe that Germany would have been happy with that, with no ambitions to look to this couple of islands off the west coast of Europe?
I've never seen any sign of any particular German interest in conquering Britain or anything of the kind. They always seem to me to have been remarkably uninterested in it. Even in 1939, we tend to overrate our influences on Hitler's thinking, and there's still a belief that Hitler had a serious intention of invading Britain in 1940. He abandoned the plan after a few weeks when it was plain that it would be too difficult. He simply wasn't bothered enough, but he did spend a huge amount of money and a huge amount of lives on invading Russia instead. So that does tend to suggest that eastwards is where Germany's interests tend to lie. I suppose once they get really a long way eastwards, they would begin to touch on the edge of India, which might have concerned us. And indeed, they certainly would have moved down towards the Persian Gulf. But the truth is that by taking on Germany in this war, we didn't strengthen our position in India or the Middle East, and subsequently we've actually lost all the imperial possessions and influence we had in those areas, largely, as I say, as a result of bankrupting ourselves in 1914-18.
Germany, as we know it today, of course, is a construct of the 19th century because it was made up of all sorts of different bits and pieces.
That's Bismarck's work, and particularly his war against Austria and the southern Germans in the late 1860s, and then, of course, the total reunification which followed his defeat of France in 1870, out of which Britain stayed. And took great care to stay, and there was an awful lot of effort expended in making sure that the issue of Belgium did not become an issue in that war, and so we were not dragged in. Now, I have to say that the Belgian treaty, which is always used as the pretext for Britain having declared war in August 1914, did not oblige us to come to Belgium's defence at all. This is a misreading of it. And the other thing is, and this is explored very much in a fascinating book called The Darkest Days by Douglas Newton, which has just come out, the British cabinet was already committed to war before Germany set foot in Belgium. And the whole thing has always been a pretext rather than a reason. There was definitely a war party in the British government, and particularly, oddly enough, in the British military, with Sir Henry Wilson, a name of some infamy in Ireland, being a large part of it. And they had actually pretty much committed themselves to go to the aid of France in 1914 without a formal alliance and behind the backs of the cabinet, and this is what they achieved.
Now, the protection, the freedom of small nations was the catch cry in Ireland.
Oh, yes.
And why so many people went to fight. But even on the face of it, you could say, well, when you look across the channel to Belgium, it's only a spit away from our shores. So you could imagine that there would be a feeling of threat were the Germans to be walking down the seafront in Ostend.
Well, maybe, but that's if the Germans were interested. Our principal enemy as a country over the past several hundred years has always been France, which, of course, sits right across the sea from us all the time. and with whom we came close to going to war in 1925, believe it or not. It's not, and with whom our relations have never been particularly good, and also with whom we had quite a nasty little war in 1940 to 44 with Vichy France. So they sit across the channel, but this doesn't mean that we demand that France ceases to occupy France. The point is, what is the German interest in Britain? The other thing about small nations is that, again, this is what Edward Grey and Herbert Asquith did in 1914, was they concentrated on the Western aspect of the First World War, to the total exclusion. In fact, the real conflict was and continued to be on the
and you say in the public
Germany and Russia.
In the public imagination, that's where the First World War still lies. You know,
because
with
all those great poets who
Wilfred
wrote
Owen
about
and Siegfried Sassoon writing about these things, and yet the conflict, you say, its heart was much further east.
Oh, it was, and that's what it was about. Germany encouraged Austria to provoke a war with Serbia, to bring in Russia, because Germany wanted a conflict with Russia, to smash Russia before huge amounts of, for instance, French investment were going into Russia at that time. France had a completely binding alliance with Russia, and that was the only reason why Germany turned west at all in that war, was to knock out France in what was supposed to be 42 days at the beginning, so they could then concentrate on what they always wanted to do, which was to take over Russia. And we know how much they wanted this, because when they finally beat the Russians in 1918, or rather when they financed the Bolsheviks to overthrow the Russian government, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which they then signed, gave Germany pretty much imperial dominance over huge areas of what had formerly been Russian territory. That had been their aim from the start. France was a nuisance because it was in an alliance with Russia, but they weren't even particularly interested in the issue of Alsace-Lorraine. It really wasn't the point. The point has always been, since Germany reunified, the great march to the east, which, as I say, continues now. The European Union is the continuation of Germany by other means. And it's actually going on now. This war in Ukraine is yet another rerun of the German march to the east, which began in 1914.
You say that when you look at the First World War and its outcome and the Treaty of Versailles, which gave rise, of course, to the Second World War, the rise of Hitler and all the rest of it because of the bad deal that was done for Germany at the time, that the consequences of winning two wars, if you like, for Britain have not exactly left them with the spoils.
Well, not losing two wars, I think, would be a more accurate description of what happened to us. And we didn't come out of the First World War with some increased imperial possessions and responsibilities, particularly in the Middle East, but we came out with the most colossal debt to the United States, on which we defaulted. And the most extraordinary thing for a country of our supposed wealth and power to do, to actually default on a debt to the United States, but that's what happened. We were so completely broke, and also, as a result, so completely under the control of the United States from then on, really from the latter years of the Second World War. Again, I'd hugely recommend a fantastic book called The Deluge by Adam Tooze, which goes into the financial aspects of the war as well as the military ones, and the aftermath, and the huge hostility which President Wilson had towards Britain during a lot of this time, going to Buckingham Palace after the war and saying, stop talking of us as cousins or brothers. We're not. We're not your cousins or your brothers, and this is an illusion. And the fact that we speak a common language does not mean that we're in any kind of permanent friendship. A piece of advice which I think British governments should bear in mind to this day, especially since it came from one of the most prominent presidents the United States has ever had. It's extraordinary how this war is misrepresented and misunderstood in history, both in global terms and in European terms.
No, there's a lot of the
great conflict between Britain and Germany. Fundamentally, it was the conflict between Germany and Russia, in which other people got involved.
Now, the what-ifs, if the First World War, if Britain had not participated in it 100 years ago next Monday, joining the conflict, would we have had home rule on this island? Would Ireland be still part of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, or what?
Well, that is an extraordinary question because, of course, as you know, the whole issue of home rule was on fire in the weeks before the war broke out. And if you look at the newspaper archives at the time, it's not the crisis in Europe, but the crisis in Ireland, which is dominating all political and journalistic discourse in that time. So I don't know. I have to say that I think anything that could have avoided the Easter Rising and the awful breach which followed the putting down of the rising and the execution of the rebel leaders would have made it easier to reach a civilized settlement on home rule. Though there would always have been the problem of the unionist minority in the north, and what on earth you could do about that. And I can't offer a solution to that now any more than anybody could then. But I have to say that the Easter Rising was definitely a product of the war. It was, as you know, not exactly instigated, but certainly helped and encouraged by the Germans. And it was seen as a stab in the back because we were at war, and that's one of the reasons for the extreme overreaction to the rising and, as I say, the execution of the rebel leaders, which, as far as I know, was the point at which many constitutional nationalists in Ireland simply turned against any possibility of compromise and led to the bitterness, which I think has now begun to leave our relationship since the visit of the Queen to Dublin a few years ago. But that was a real turning point. 1916 was the point at which it became really, really difficult to solve.
Well,
without 1914, no 1916.
No 1916. But going back to something you mentioned in passing there, that Germany pushing east and the flirtation of Ukraine with the EU, giving rise to the fall of Yanukovych, and then the intervention of Putin in Crimea and now in eastern Ukraine.
Yep.
I mean, Putin is characterized as the bad guy. Do you think the EU really are the bad guys?
Well, you mentioned Versailles, and here we have a point actually made many years ago by Sir Roderick Braithwaite, probably the best ambassador Britain ever sent to Moscow, who warned so long ago, I think Yeltsin was still in power at the time, that the attitude of the West towards Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union was alarmingly similar to the attitude of the victorious Allies towards Germany in the 1920s. The treatment of Germany at that time paralleled in some ways the treatment of Russia. It was bullying, it was overbearing, it was triumphalist, and it led to bitterness. And what we have now is a Russia which has said, and Vladimir Putin has been saying it. I have to look this up, but I think it was you can go back to a speech he made in Vienna more than 7 years ago, saying, look, this whole business of pushing NATO and the European Union further and further eastwards must stop. You've gone too far. We were promised when we abandoned, as Russia did, in what has to be one of the most amazing gestures of surrender without a war in human history. They abandoned the Warsaw Pact completely. They allowed their own union to break up. They permitted, between clenched teeth, I have to say, the Baltic states to leave. They actually allowed Ukraine and Belarus to leave, but the quid pro quo they believed they had for all this from the United States in particular was there wouldn't be then an extension of NATO up to the new far western borders of the truncated Russia, and that's precisely what they've got. And they've warned against this again and again. And in Ukraine, everybody knows this. There's a fantastic passage in the book by Zbigniew Brzezinski about how Ukraine is absolutely crucial in the standing of Russia. Ukraine and Russia put up with being for many years a non-aligned neutral state, but it wasn't going to put up with, and it made clear it wasn't going to put up with Ukraine being brought into the EU orbit by this association agreement. And this is the point of no return. And the EU went ahead and did it. And to characterize Putin as the aggressor in this seems to me to be extraordinarily purblind to all the developments that happened before. It's not, people don't these days invade countries with tanks and planes. The way in which you advance power these days, and the sophisticated way in which it's done, is people power, civil society organizations, and as happened in Ukraine, you have a legitimate elected president driven from office by a violent mob. Now, you may approve of the violent mob, and you may disapprove of the president. You may think that the Ukrainian government wasn't particularly worthy of anybody's defense, but the fact remains that if you adopt violence and unconstitutional methods in the overthrow of the government, you can't be terribly surprised if your opponents feel they've been licensed to do the same. And that's the position we're in. the European Union, backed very much by the United States in this, pushed very hard here for Ukraine to be incorporated into the EU sphere of influence. The association agreement is not just about economics; it's about politics and military links as well. And that's absolutely clear in the text of the agreement.
And Peter, the lessons of history should be learnt, should be studied more closely, and
all the time. And anybody, frankly, who hasn't heard of or understood the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk doesn't really have any business even talking about the current crisis in Ukraine. Look at that, and look at, as I said, fantastic chapters on the subject in Alan Tooze's book, and see how history is repeating itself in this region, and you'll be amazed and educated, and also a good deal more cautious about accepting the standard conventional wisdom line on what's going on in Ukraine.
Peter Hitchens, columnist with the Mail on Sunday, thank you very much for joining us.
My pleasure, thank you.